Therefore it says, wake up, sleeper. Get up from the dead. Christ will shine on you. So be careful to live your life wisely, not foolishly. Take advantage of every opportunity because these are evil times. Because of this, don't be ignorant, but understand the Lord's will. Saints of God, my eyes have seen the glory and the coming of the Lord. He's trampling out the vintage with the grapes of wrath of scorn. He hath loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. I see him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dew and damps. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamp. His day is marching on. Hello and welcome to Conversation with Faith Leaders. My name is Brandon A.J. Davis. I'm the founder of Content Writing Service and Conversation with Faith Leaders, and I'm extremely excited and delighted to be able to have a conversation that I think is very important as we deal with the struggles of our current society. I have with me today Robert P. Jones, who is the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. I also have with me Ella Myers, who is the Director of Undergraduate Studies, Political Science Department, and Associate Professor of Gender Studies and Political Science. Also, the Reverend Dr. Phillip L. Pointer, who is the Senior Pastor of the St. Mark Baptist Church in Arkansas. He is also Associate Professor of Philosophy and Religion and the Chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Philander Smith College. Lastly, but not least, I have Dr. Shana Eutsay, who is the Program Director at Fordham University Graduate School of Education. Today, these persons will help us to articulate a very special conversation regarding race, religion, and reason, understanding white supremacy and American Christianity. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the broadcast.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Hi,
everybody.
Good afternoon.
So I'm delighted to have all of you here. First of all, let me say thank you for taking the time out of your schedules to be with me today to have this conversation. I think this is something very important as we try to understand what is happening within society and culture, and then to contribute our thoughts and facts and evidence of our own research and study as a means to combat racism and the ugliness of white supremacy in our culture today. And sort of kind of defend Christianity in the truest tense of what Christianity should be, a reflection of Jesus Christ. So not to belabor the moment, I want to get right into our first opening statement. And anyone feel free to jump in here. Old world racism steeped in nostalgia has perpetuated new normalcy in both society and Christianity today. What would be its lasting effects if left unchecked? And what should our response to it be? Whoever wants to go first.
I will say, since these others are being extremely kind, I will say that the idea of this over racism that's steeped in nostalgia, nostalgia is an enemy of vision and progress, just in and of itself in most contexts. It's a falsified view of the past and of history. And we see that with the attack of, the 1619 Project. We see that with the intended promotion of the 1776 Project, as if the reality of the U.S. and its racism was non-existent in 1776, as if that's a better year than 1619. The country's its founding documents were racist. Its policies in organization were racist. And so that nostalgia is a mismanaged view of history. It's a lie that people tell themselves to perpetuate the privilege that they have enjoyed from that old world racism, as you're calling it. So if it's unchecked, it continues to fester. We continue to see the fruit of it in new generations, generations that are young, burgeoning in what are majority spaces, carry with them those old mentalities. The sad reality is, with the election and popularity of the former president Trump, what you then saw was the opportunity or a sense of emboldenedness to outwardly profess that old world racism. And so it has to be checked, especially in the Christian community and by the Christian community. It can't be checked by the Christian community until it's checked in the Christian community. And that requires friends in the faith and partners who have traditionally been in the majority culture, admitting their privilege and then listening and adjusting. We have these conversations and people listen, but the question is, what adjustments are you going to make to your preaching, your teaching, how you disciple your members, and then your political stances. So if it's unchecked, it just perpetuates and increases the ugliness, vitriolic conversations that are had, and then the policies that keep people bound. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Pointer. I appreciate that. Who else would like to respond to this statement?
I have something I'd like to say. I wanted to draw attention to the part of your question that was about what should our response be? And I like the way you phrase that, because that already gets at the idea that this requires a mass and collective response, right? The our is plural, and it suggests that there is a we that is engaged in this action. But at the same time, I just wanted to say that I do think the challenge is to mobilize white people to join in, what has been, millennia long struggle, but to get white people who currently benefit from the regime of white supremacy to recognize it, but do more than recognize it, right? I mean, coming to understand one's privilege is a necessary step, but what we're really after is mobilization and action. And I think we see some promising signs of that from this summer in terms of the growing presence of white Americans in the Black Lives Matter protests, but obviously there's tons of work to be done. And so I just want to note that, white people who benefit from the existing order have more responsibility to bear in repairing things.
And thank you for saying that. And so one of the things that I've been concerned about is that too often we want to try to put the blame on one particular place, or we want to shift blame into one particular direction. I had a conversation some months ago, and I shared with Joel Gaza, who is the author of America's Unholy Ghost. And in the conversation, he and I both agreed that it is a terrible thing to put the responsibility of ending racism in America on African Americans when it didn't start with us. It was not our fault. And so whenever we're dealing with conversations about race and religion, I think it's important for us to just deal with the facts that this is not something that we created, but it is something that we all can get into and something that we all can help to combat and to disengage. So I don't want to call, but Dr. Eutsay, do you want to respond to old world racism steeped in nostalgia and this perpetuation of a new normalcy in both society and Christianity?
Yes, I do wholeheartedly agree with what's been said. I think what will help, I think sometimes we get the idea of waiting for someone to do something. And as we see in the lineage of old world racism, it takes a very long time for those that align with that ideology to take onus. And so that's why we've been dealing with it for so long, because we're waiting for those who created it to make change. And so sometimes when you're waiting for someone to do something, then you're at a disadvantage of your growth and progress. So I do want to challenge that idea that we that have been impacted by the racism, that we too take and just take a stance of making our own infrastructure, building our own spaces and places where we take the knowledge and wisdom that we've gained to make more strategic perpetuancies to move forward, so that while those that are waiting to be honest and to take on the reins of what it is that they have done, we too can do what's necessary to build our own and make forges ahead. So I think it's important that we educate ourselves on the information, be honest and open that this is real life. Also take up a stance that we have the ability to build what is necessary to move forward. I think it's really important that we create a able-bodied mentality more so than a dependency, because then it goes right back to some of the underpinnings that we need for someone to do something, or we're waiting for somebody to make a stance. I think it is important for all parties to take ownership, and it is important for all parties to take up a stance and to move forward, whatever that needs to be in whatever shape, form, or facet. But I do think it can be problematic if we're one party waiting for someone else to have a realization or revelation, and we're stuck and we're behind. So I think it's important that we, that are owning up to what's happening, and those that are willing to know that this information is very valuable and we're going to use it to create healthier and holistic infrastructures to move forward. So those are my thoughts on that.
Finally, Dr. Jones, please share with me your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I thank you, all of you, for such wisdom. So I think so much of the important ground has been covered, but I'll say one thing about the term old world racism. And we had a couple of dates thrown out: 1776, 1691. I'm gonna throw one more out: 1493. This is a date that every white Christian should know. It is the date that a very important Christian doctrine was pronounced by the Pope in 1493, called the Doctrine of Discovery. Now, this is before there were Protestants and Catholics in the world. This is before the kind of Protestant churches broke off. So this is virtually all of the West. Well, it is all of the Western Church under this edict. And this edict essentially said that if you were Christian and you were Western European, and you encountered in your travels and in your conquests any person any sort of undiscovered lands, right, from Western Europe, and they were inhabited by anyone who did not practice Christianity, that those lands and those people could be conquered and seized in the name of the church and in the name of the Western European country you were from. And it is this version of Christianity that lands on the shores of the United States. I think that's really important to remember, that this built into the very DNA, into the very beginnings of the kind of Christianity that landed here, already had, and there's no other way to say it, really had white supremacy built in. This very idea, right, that the lives of whites were more important and more valuable than the lives of others, and that they had divine permission, and divine sanction to dominate other people in the name of the church and in the name of God, right? And this was what justifies genocide among Native Americans and all kinds of violence toward them. It's what underlies and justifies chattel slavery in this country, and we've never really recovered from that. And I think part of the work that's being done is to go all the way back, right? This is more than 500 years of this history of white supremacy sitting inside of white Christianity, and I think excising that. And I'm going to go back to the very beginning of this other to the introduction here about this is an ought thing. What the gap between what the church is and what the church ought to be, and what Christian churches ought to be, I think is really what we're talking about trying to close, right? That for so long that gap has been so wide, and particularly so wide around racial justice and racial equality issues, because it has built into it this very idea of this hierarchical relationship between people who thought of themselves as white, and all others, that we're still really trying to rid ourselves of.
Absolutely. And let me say thank you for mentioning that. For those of you who are interested in learning more about the doctrine of discovery, Mark Charles, and I believe I'm pronouncing this right, Song Chan Ra, who
Yep.
wrote this book called Unsettling Truths. This book is called Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery. And so for those of you who are interested in learning more, please go to Amazon and get this book. This is a very important book, and it helps you to understand exactly what Dr. Jones was just saying. Let me just quickly highlight a section here that I thought was very interesting, where it talks about the Dom Diversa. And it says here, Dom Diversa would identify Caesarians, a common term for Muslims at the time, and pagans, essentially identifying any non-Christian or others as those who could be targeted for perpetual slavery. And so that was the idea. This was a papal bull that was initiated by Pope Nicholas V, June 18th, 1452. And so this book helps you to discover exactly what Dr. Jones was referring to, and the situation that we find ourselves in, and why it is so embroiled in Christianity today. Before I forget, let me say, Dr. Jones, my pastor, the Reverend Dr. Alphonse Allen Jr., Allen Temple AME Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, is watching. He is a fan of yours. He loves your book. He and I was talking a few weeks ago. We were talking a few weeks ago, and he mentioned some quotes out of the book. And as soon as I heard the quotes, I said, "Listen, that's White Too Long by Robert P. Jones." And he said, "Yes, sir, son. That's it. That's the book, man. Like, you need to get this book." Like, no, I got the book. And so I have my pastor's permission. I have my pastor's permission to invite you to Allen Temple AME Church in Cincinnati. And so he said, please send us whatever information we need to have you to come to the temple. It would be an honor to have you to preach from the pulpit of Allen Temple AME Church. So after we're done here, please send me your honorarium, your schedule, all the information I would need to make that happen on behalf of my pastor, Dr. Alphonse Allen.
Honored. Thank you. It's kind.
Yes, sir. So this question is to you, Dr. Jones. Take a moment and explain the process you undertook to write White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity.
Yeah, well, my background is in social science. And so typically, I don't write in such a personal vein, but this book really was a personal one. So, I think all books are personal in some way. This one, I think, remarkably so, because it was really about my own journey. It was really the book I needed to write. So I grew up in the deep South in Mississippi. I grew up Southern Baptist. I have went to Southern Baptist churches my whole life. I have a degree, undergraduate degree from a Southern Baptist college. I have a Master of Divinity degree from a Southern Baptist seminary. So these are my people, and also my family goes back 6 generations into Middle Georgia and Bibb and Twiggs County around Macon, Georgia. So part of this, really was my trying to wrestle and reckon with my own family's legacy here, that is full of Baptist preachers. And also full of dotted with people who enslaved other human beings. So trying and there was no grand contradiction between those two things in the family tree. So trying to get a real sense of what that meant, for the Christianity that I inherited, to really wrestle with that, not only the sort of personal history, but the theological implications of that. And then so I kind of use the tools that I kind of have at my disposal, kind of use the social sciences, my own family's history, but really came to the conclusion that this is, as I mentioned, this kind of early, these sentiments from the 15th century are still very much with us today. We I think in white Christian churches don't say them out loud as much as we used to, but partially that's because there has been an institutional, a successful, institutionalization of those issues. And once you have those institutions and laws and policies built, you don't have to do as much overt justification. All you have to do to ensure that the kind of white supremacy built into them continues is to be silent. And I think that's the era of the church that I grew up in, is a church that was silent, but only silent after it had been complicit in building these structures of inequality and white supremacy that I found all around me. So the book is really my trying to wrestle with that family history and trying to wrestle, I hope, along with my fellow white Christians, with what we can do to finally rid ourselves of this legacy, so it's not something that we hand down to our children and grandchildren.
Again, if you have not heard of this book, please go to Amazon, get this book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity by Dr. Robert P. Jones. You need to have this book in your library. I recommend this book greatly. So, and part of me doing some writing of my own for my book that I hope to be released later this year, there's a position paper that I wrote called Race, Religion, and Reason, the Tilting Windmills of American System of Values. And so as I was trying to articulate some fundamental thoughts about the American system of values, which there are 12 system of values, and depending on who you're researching, you might find there are 15 additional 3 that was added after 1976. The person who created it, the name is slipping my mind right now. But there are 12 systems of values that are thought to be American core values. And so when I was doing some work about it, I ran across an article by Dr. Ella Mayer. Did I say that right? Is it Mayer or Myers?
It's Myers.
Myers. I want to make sure I get that correct. Dr. Ella Myers. And so I ran across an article that you had written, Beyond the Wages of Whiteness, the Bows on the Irrationality of Anti-Black Racism. And so can you just give us a brief introduction about this essay? I'm going to post the link in a second, but if you can just talk to us about this essay and then tell us about your upcoming book as well.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So the essay is really sort of a taste of the bigger book project that I'm wrapping up. I'm sending off my manuscript next month. So the book is really animated by a desire to better understand the dynamics of American white identity here and now. But I turn to Du Bois because I think he has some really important lessons for us that continue to be, salient here and now. And in particular, and this is what comes through in the article, I'm interested in the kind of pluralistic way that Du Bois thinks about whiteness, and particularly whiteness in the US. And part of what I find fascinating in Du Bois's work is that sometimes I think there's a desire to try to, simplify the phenomenon of American whiteness. And sometimes there are even ideas from his work that are used to do so. So probably the idea from his work that's most well known, even if it's not attached to his name, people have usually heard this idea, is the idea of whiteness as like a non-monetary wage, basically whiteness as compensation. And what Du Bois called that was, he argued that whiteness sometimes operated as a public and psychological wage. And what he meant by that was that in American capitalist society, for many poor whites in particular, their identity as white allows them to have a sense of status and sort of worth within a system in which they're otherwise exploited, but it allows them to feel that they are not at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And that you can imagine that idea has come up even more since the 2016 election, as analysts have been trying to understand Trump's appeal and the seeming support he had among white working class voters. And so that idea of whiteness as a non-monetary wage, but as kind of a status benefit, came back into public conversation, I would say. But the other thing I would like to point out, and this is part of what I do in my book, is kind of look at some of the other complicated ways that Du Bois instructs us to think about how whiteness works in American society. And I'll just mention one of those right now because I think it connects up with some of the conversation we were already having, and particularly with what Dr. Jones had mentioned when he brought up the doctrine of discovery. And that is that Du Bois also has this very powerful account of what I call whiteness as dominion. So apart from that argument about whiteness sort of serving as a kind of status for folks, he talks about whiteness as dominion and he talks about it in religious terms. And he says, this is from a 1920 essay called The Souls of White Folk, which is obviously referencing his famous book, The Souls of Black Folk. But in that essay, he says, if we really try to figure out what is whiteness, what is this idea of whiteness that people are so attached to? And what he says is whiteness is ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen. And the whole essay really tries to expose this sort of faith that has this very proprietary territorial notion that says the earth belongs to those, this is Du Bois's language, the earth belongs to those with pale skin. Right. And he's trying to expose the danger of that ideology. And what I'm interested in is the way that, throughout his work, Du Bois gives us these very arresting ideas that we can use in the present to try to better respond to and rework these dominant modes of white identity. So that's a piece of my project and what I'm interested in thinking and talking about.
Listen, this is exciting. This is really exciting for me. And part of me reading your essay led me to purchase the work that you mentioned in your writing, Dark Water. This is the essays that Dr. W.B. Du Bois produced after his very public separation from the NAACP. So Dark Water, Voices from Within the Veil, which has also the collection of those essays, Souls of White Folks. You can find this on Amazon as well. $6. Can you believe it? $6. Go get this book, okay?
I mean.
So let's get into our first question because I don't want to miss Dr. Jones being able to contribute. I know that you have to be somewhere at 4 o'clock. So I'm going to start with you. How did the narrative of white supremacy influence Christianity and create the current social reality? You're muted. You're muted.
There we go. Yeah, I'd start back and say, even the word influence there sounds kind of quaint to me, and sort of soft. I mean, it really has been with us all along. So, it's not as if it were some external thing that drifted into American Christianity at some point in time. Like I said, it landed on the shores as kind of part of it. And so I think that's why it's been so difficult for white Christians to sort this out, because it has been something literally inside the faith and inside our churches from the get-go. So when it's been there that long, it is hard, I think, to sort it out. But it really is about, this idea again that it really is, that it is a God-ordained thing, that the social order, right, where whites are above everyone else in the social order, is part of the kind of God-ordained order over the universe. And so again, even though we're not saying that out loud in many white Christian churches today, that runs right under it. And you can see it in lots of different ways. I mean, even I think, and one of the things I'll just pick one here to kind of delve into, because I think it's really important, particularly for more evangelical churches like the one I grew up in, and that is the whiteness of Jesus, right? The assertion that Jesus was a white man, and I think one thing obviously, if anything, he was Middle Eastern. He certainly wasn't Western European, and so but yet all the kind of paintings, the depictions, and especially in white churches, are all white. And if you ask yourself, how would that change, if it weren't, and how would the language change? So I grew up with this language of let Jesus come into your heart, this evangelical language. And how does that change if Jesus is seen as a black man and not as a white man? Particularly, in youth groups, when you're thinking about all this teaching around like sexuality, and I think this particularly gets targeted at girls, about kind of sexual purity. And there was often this sense of like, you're going to spiritually be married to God. And there were these kind of promise rings and all this kind of stuff in the culture. And I think that, how does that change, right? If that's about, if Jesus, the representation of God, is a black man. Right. And my real sense of it is that most of that theology doesn't work. If Jesus is seen not as white. And so what does that mean then? That means the theology is broken. Right. If the theology is race and it's dependent, its very logic is dependent on the race of our Savior. It tells you something deeply, deeply wrong has happened. And so I would say that like that's at least just one place where we can see it so powerfully working at something as central as how Jesus, right, is conceptualized in most white Christian churches.
Wow. Listen, that part that you said, let Jesus come into your heart, and how does that work if Jesus is perceived as a black person? That shapes theology in a whole different way in terms of coming from an evangelical or a Southern Baptist. I mean, that just kind of puts you in a whole different sphere. Dr. Eutsay, you're shaking your head, you're nodding. I know your wheels are turning. Please respond.
Yes, even the idea of referring to white Christians as evangelicals, and the idea that the black Christians are referred to as the black church. There's already a divide within the theology. If we're saying that Jesus is the savior of the world, then there should be no differentiation between his children. I do find it interesting when folks refer to white Christians as evangelicals, but that evangelistic ideology or that term itself renders a superiority, angelic, purity, right? Some of the tenets of having a more divine connection to the creator than those who are of darker skin tone. When you talk about black Christians, you do not say evangelical. So even the terms would be very, very important to adjust as we talk about moving forward and making progress and delineating some of those narratives down to not just the science, but just the basic level of humanity, servitude, and service. And so I think that we have to start using different terms. Most of us here on the panel are educators and we're leaders. And so we have to start readjusting and realigning some of the terms and the operatives of the terms, because it does help with making a more holistic and more homogeneous environment. As it relates to worship and the social reality of the influence of Christianity and create the current social reality, I think that it's really important to make sure that we are informing those that we are leading and serving, and not creating a level of dictatorship, monarchy, or I know this and you don't, because then that goes back to the perpetuancy of someone being a superior. And when we talk about faith, everyone is on the same level playing field. We're all coming into community. We're all coming together for the necessity of feeling hope, experiencing otherness. In psychology, we have this term called otherness, where you just don't want to experience the oppression of society. So you come into a community because you want an other experience. So I think it's important to start looking at terms, operative terms, jargons, narratives, and the way that we communicate about the Savior, because we need more of a communic language, a community language, and we need to show that it's not necessarily what we thought, but it's more homogeneous than what we think. And the purpose of the church is to serve the being of a human being, whatever makes that individual tick, think, what allows them to be purposeful, what gives them meaning to life and to live life. So I think if we want to remove some of the racial tension, we have to go back to the quality of humanity and start using terms that are more, I guess, more service oriented, less racially driven. And I think that can help with the undoings with some of those things that we've been previously talking about.
Dr. Pointer, She said something, and I want you to quickly touch on it as you respond to this question. She talked about rhetoric. She mentioned specifically the words that we use in terms of influencing Christianity. Can you talk about the job of the Black preacher to deal with white supremacy and its influence on Christianity?
Yeah, the rhetoric issue is a major issue. Semantics matter, words matter, because they create constructs within the mind that produce the social reality that we face. I think major deficiencies of the theology that that any person is better than any other person, white supremacy, patriarchy, all of those things. The basic premise of those ideas is individualism, which I think is Larry Sidingtop writes that book, Inventing the Individual, that speaks of this idea of, the concept that is promoted in most Protestant settings, that you receive Jesus as your personal savior. That idea creates this distinction among humanity. And while, there's a theological truth to there being a difference between believer and unbeliever in a Christian context, if not managed well and spoken of properly, we will forget that there is a human family that we are called to and a part of, and there is no supremacy among the human family. So, as we talk about rhetoric, you talk about the Black preacher doing his or her best to dismantle that construct, because that construct affects Black people as well. The Body Keeps the Score is another book that speaks of the fact that we have literally inherited trauma in our DNA. So we are also conditioned in many ways to acquiesce to this idea of white supremacy. And I not to speak negatively of persons who are part of multi-ethnic churches, but there are some among the Black community that grew up in a Black church, that went to a predominantly white church because they feel that it's a better church than the church that they grew up in. That construct, the Black preacher has to deconstruct that, and our words matter. We got to paint pictures with words. We have to speak the language of community. We have to address the ills of our culture and the misinterpretations of Scripture that have led to the idea that anyone is supreme or better than anyone else. That has to be a part of our regular, consistent dialogue with our congregations in preaching and teaching. Yeah.
Absolutely. Dr. May,
I couldn't hear that last statement. Could you repeat that?
Number one, and then we'll go to question number two. Okay. And there may be some technical difficulty as well.
That's okay.
Okay.
Okay. I think I got it. I just wanted to follow up on what was just said. I really liked the point that was made about a sort of anti-hierarchical ethics as being at the center of Christianity. And then the other thing I guess I wanted to say was, it seems like, I think there's this profound tension between, on the one hand, the need to sort of expose how central white supremacy has been to the Christian church, right? Which is what we've been talking about. But at the same time, alongside of that, also recognizing the liberatory power of the Black church, particularly in the US context, and how do you sort of like hold those two things together at the same time? And I guess I was also thinking a little bit about what Dr. Jones had said about the very way in which the Savior is talked about, represented, depicted. And it made me think, because I always have W.E.B. Du Bois on the brain, but in a lot of his work, he was navigating that difficulty that I just mentioned as well, between deep skepticism of the way, the mainstream white church had been used to support slavery, to support Jim Crow, and just to support the degradation of Black life in general. That he was doing that at the same time that he was also affirming Christianity as a source of human dignity and emancipation. And one way that I think he tried to navigate that was particularly through reimagining the Christ figure. So in a lot of his writings, he will write about Christ as a Black man. He has a really memorable essay called Jesus Christ in Texas. And in that essay and some of his other essays, he actually likens the Christ figure to the lynched Black man in America, and sort of anticipates in some of that work, like the scholarship, like James Cones's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and is actually bringing together that figure of Christ and Christ on the cross and the Black figure lynched on the tree. So I just wanted to mention that as like one of the kind of creative ways that Du Bois tries to sort of redeem Christianity for what he sees as its true purpose and away from its white supremacist roots.
Thank you, and I really appreciate you talking about Du Bois and his work in that specific area. So I want to skip to question 3. Because I know that Dr. Jones has to leave us in a little bit. Question number 3 asks, explain the terms whiteness as wage, whiteness as privilege, whiteness as dominion. Also, how do we correlate with understanding the events of January 6, 2020? 2021, excuse me. I should have put 2021. So I want to get your view as you understand these terms. Explain them as you see them or as you understand them. And Dr. Jones, can you go first?
Sure. Well, I think Dr. Myers has already tiptoed up to these. I'm going to jump straight to the January 6th piece, given that she's covered some of that ground already. So, I wrote a piece on January 7th, looking back at the horrific images that we saw as, a violent group of Trump supporters stormed our Capitol. And what I was, even as someone who had, written a whole book on white supremacy and Christianity, I was still shaken by the number of Christian symbols among this crowd that so easily intermingled with symbols of white supremacy and anti-Semitism on that day, and violence, and that were justifying violence. There were giant, it was a big wooden cross that was erected. There was a giant white cross that was carried up the steps. There were Bibles, there were flags, said, Trump is my president, Jesus is my savior, that looked exactly like the Trump flag. There was the Christian flag, the flag that many people see in church, see on the platform up in front of their church. It's a white flag with a blue canton in the upper corner with a red Latin cross. And it was actually the flag officially adopted in 1942, I believe, by the predecessor of the National Council of Churches. It was certainly in the sanctuary in the church I had growing up, and that flag was carried. The official flag, then adopted by the National Council of Churches, was carried into the sanctuary, into the inner sanctum of the Capitol. It was carried into the breach chamber. Alongside of the Confederate flag. And again, these people weren't in conflict. These people were part of the same movement, and I think taking that really seriously. And this, I'm going to kind of bring the thread through of ownership. If there's anything I think that is really held white Christian supporters to President Trump, it is his basically his straightforward talking about this country as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. Right, that you'll hear him say things like, that if you don't stand up and fight now, America as you know it will be over. You won't have a country anymore. But if you interrogate all the prepositions about our country, if you, who's the you, who's the our, these are always straightforward, manifestations of evoking a white Christian country and asking white Christians to basically, if they can't win at the ballot box, to resort to violence, to uphold it. And we've of course seen, from Reconstruction through the erection of Jim Crow and Black disenfranchisement, whites being willing to resort to violence, when the other measures failed. And I would not have thought I was going to see this in my lifetime, but we saw it in front of our eyes. And I think we shouldn't deny what we saw, right? We shouldn't make it just about white supremacy or just about Trump supporters. This was about representations of these people are telling us who they are, right? They were white supremacists and they were Christian. And we really should sit with that reality, that's what that group is the one who brought the Confederate flag into the Capitol, and violently assaulted police officers.
Absolutely. Dr. Eutsay?
Well, yes, I'm going to jump as well to the latter end of the question because we all covered a bit of the previous areas. But again, definitely would say I would attribute my response to reading Dr. Meyer's article where whites are literally considering themselves as an entitlement to the universe. They own the universe. And so that means they can supersede government, law, and any other construct that has been constructed to keep peace or some form of order, if you will. And so I think that the events that took place on January 6th was very much so illustrating that white people, some of them really believe that they are entitled to whatever it is that they desire and prefer, regardless of whatever construct is in place. And no matter how we slice this, it was wrong. It was more than just inappropriate. There's no word to express it. And I think that we have to do a better job of owning what it is and just really looking at how to move forward in this kind of society. This is what we are living in. This is the world we live in. It's not just in a history book. It's not just something that is passed on through a story for someone that shared it from a book or something like that. This is real life. This is real life events. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that there was some talk about a part 2 episode possibly happening within the next coming week. And so there's been a Trump statue erected, a gold statue, if I'm not mistaken, to just show forth that no matter what, that white supremacy will remain supreme. And this is the notion, the narrative that's being carried out. And I think that this definitely is something that folks shouldn't just pass off, as Dr. Jones said, or just looked at as an incident or issue. This is a very universal concern, and we do need to put things in place that can combat this. And I'm not saying combat as in physical fight, but mentally, psychologically, socially, economically, all of those things that would create a strong infrastructure for folks to do their best to not allow this to continue further, because the world does not belong to one race. The world or the universe itself is not entitled to just one group of people or persons. I think that it really showed the narrative that we've all been trying to dispel and break down. Black Lives Matter, even with that narration, it shows that white supremacy is still in existence, and it will use politics, it will use religion, and it will use race to do its due diligence to be supreme, or to consider themselves to be the only true proven civilization. And that's not okay.
Dr. Myers, I want to ask you specifically, in with these 3 terms, do you think, I want you to respond to the question, the latter part of the question, if you will, because you have already responded to the terms, but I want to ask, do you think that whiteness as wage and privilege and dominion were the key factors that led to January 6th?
I mean, I think I was very persuaded by what both of you just said, in the sense that, like, if you look at that phenomenon, what you see are these tightly bound, you know, it's not just whiteness, right? It's also Christianity. It's also anti-Semitism. There's also a lot of patriarchal language involved in those displays that we saw on the 6th. So it's hard to boil. I mean, we like simple explanations, of course, but I think it's hard to boil it down to one thing. I mean, I would agree with the idea that I think, what we've been talking about is whiteness as dominion, which is the language I use in some of my work. I certainly think that's on display in that moment, precisely because what you see is just this sense of no limits. You feel, authorized to do something unprecedented in American history, which is seize the Capitol. I mean, all of that just speaks to this profound sense of ownership and of impunity, right? But I guess if it's okay, I kind of wanted to ask a question back about the 6th, just to any of the other panelists, just because I was struck by what Dr. Jones had said about how we really have to face the fact that this phenomenon that we saw on the 6th is at its core about white supremacy bonded with Christianity, right? It's that whole, it's one thing, right? That it contains those elements. And I guess I just wonder, like, you had mentioned earlier, Dr. Jones, about speaking to faith leaders in white churches. And I guess I just wonder, for anybody here, like, do you think that there's a special role for white Christian leaders in response to this kind of extremist action? Like, is there a particular role that, more enlightened figures in white churches have to play to sort of speak back and sort of say what we've been saying, which is, this is absolutely unacceptable, but it's also not a one-off, and it's something we have to take seriously and respond to?
Dr. Jones, you want to take that question?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the reasons why I wrote the book, beyond the fact that it was a book I needed to write for myself, is because I think it's going to take people with my background and people who look like me talking to other people who look like me to take this quite seriously. I mean, black leaders from Douglas to Du Bois to King to Cone, have been making this point for more than a century. It has only partially gotten through. And I think we do have these moments in our history where people are more open to hearing things than they were. The Civil Rights Movement was a moment as well. Dr. King was obviously hoping that white Christian churches, in a letter from Birmingham jail, he's directly addressing white Christian churches and leaders, and his disappointment that they're sitting silently. What he called it, sitting silently behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows. It's a damning portrait of what white Christian churches were doing to and for their congregants. And so, I think this is a moment for, God help us if we don't, for us to speak up. And I think the one thing I'll say here too is that I think that the thing that still is getting through, and this is something that both Douglas and Du Bois were really spoke powerfully about, is that, white supremacy, and I truly believe this, it is a kind of madness, right? I mean, it is a world upside down. And so whites ultimately have self-interest here, right? It's not just about righting the wrongs. I mean, it certainly is about that. Don't get me wrong. I mean, racial justice and that sort of sense of repairing the damage and compensating people for damage done, that is absolutely important. But I think what many whites forget is that, white supremacy doesn't just damage people of color, right? It deeply warps and damages white people. And this is something, again, I mean, all the way back to, Douglas and Du Bois are both very clear about this, and James Baldwin as well. And so, if we're going to heal even ourselves, I think this is a moment for us to do it. And again, I think if we're really thinking about what's the legacy we pass down to our children and grandchildren, and if we don't want to hand them a version of this madness and pass it down to them, It really is up to us to finally end it.
Absolutely. Anybody else would like to respond to Dr. Meyer's question?
I have 1,000 thoughts right now. I think it proves that Carol Anderson is a prophet. In 2016, she wrote White Rage, and she argues that whenever there seems to be Black progress, there's an aggressive, violent white response. And so you get the Civil War and Reconstruction, and you have the aggressive, violent season of Jim Crow. You get the Voter Rights Act 1965, and then you get the aggressive white response of the Southern strategy. Then the election of Barack Obama, you get the aggressive and sowing the seeds for the violence we saw on January 6th of Tea Party persons. And then, of course, what January 6th was really about, it was not about Trump losing the election. It was because Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, and Atlanta made him lose. That was the problem. The problem was Black people showed up and voted the man out of office. And so the incredible response that many of the Dr. Jones described is the idea that there's no way that Black people can rise up in these numbers to do it. There are people who say, you will never convince me that 80 million people voted for Joe Biden. Well, yeah, 80 million. Some voted for Joe Biden and others voted against Trump. That's what happened. And it's because of those African-American centers of population came out in such aggressive and significant numbers that we saw this tide turn in the Electoral College, especially in Georgia with the work of Stacey Abrams. The response was going to be based on Carol Anderson's assertions through history. It was going to be violent. It was going to be vitriolic. And we saw that at the Capitol, to the degree that some went there with murder on their mind.
Absolutely.
And that part, that's the issue that is at hand. And so, I think it was said earlier, I think the words matter here. White Christians have a part, but all the people we call Christians are not. Our foreparents would say, everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. Mm-hmm. So just because they have erected a cross on the top of their building, and they read from a Bible and they sing hymns, that does not make that a Christian community. Christian is to be Christ-like. You cannot be like Christ. You cannot just preach the gospel. Well, we are preaching the gospel because the gospel is inherently about justice vertically and justice horizontally. When Jesus says in his initial foray into public ministry, when Jesus says the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, he says justice issues, preach the gospel to the poor, liberty to the captives, those in prison, recovery of sight to the blind, that's healthcare. Those who are bruised, he speaks of people who have mental and psychological and emotional issues based on being traumatized. So it's inherently social. So I'll stop there. I got a whole bunch of other thoughts, but
preaching.
I think Christianity, Christians have to call these pseudo-Christians non-Christians. I think that's where it starts.
I love it. I love it. Dr. Eutsay, before you respond, Dr. Jones, I know that you have to go in a couple of seconds. I want to say thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule and being with me today. This is a seminal honor. I have enjoyed your book. I have your other book that you wrote, I think maybe 2 years ago, On Order. And so I look forward to getting that and diving into it as well. But again, thank you so much for your time and your contributions to this conversation.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Eutsay, Dr. Pointer, Dr. Myers. Really appreciate you taking time out. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Dr. Davis, as well. Been a great conversation. So lovely to be a part of it. So thank you.
Absolutely. And I look forward to connecting with you.
Thanks.
So, Dr. Eutsay, I want to get your response to what Dr. Myers just said, and feel free to take a text if you need to, because Dr. Pointer just did. He did some. He did what we in the AME church we tell licensed exhorters: you can preach, you just can't take a text.
Yeah. I did want to just chime in a little bit, because I do think that there is a level of responsibility that is expected as those that say that they are of the Christian faith. If you see this behavior where someone is carrying the Christian flag and they're doing things that is just counterproductive or counteractive to what the symbol represents or should reflect, I think that someone should be speaking up and speaking out. The ways to do that, whether you're going to write an article, whether you're going to use your broadcast and platform to not necessarily denounce per se, because that's taking a different kind of stance, but bringing enlightenment, shining light in a dark place. That is the operative definition of enlightenment, is bringing light into a dark place. And the events that took place on January 6th created a very dark cloud. It pulled a lot of bad, harsh memories to the forefront of some Black and brown communities. There were some people who were living when that was normal. And so now we have a generation that, like I said earlier, have read about this in textbooks or heard about it in short story form. But to see it illustrated in real time, that does depict another level of darkness. And so there should be folks that do stand up and speak against it, because it is very necessary to maintain enlightenment, which is creating spaces where people can know the truth of the matter and to move forward. We're not interested in moving backwards. The Black and brown community is not interested in reliving history that kept us downtrodden and, divided and brokenhearted. We don't want to relive that, but we do need to know information so that we can make a better future, so that we can continue to generate hope. And the term resilience that is often researched and studied and used, or has been used as a buzzword when you're identifying the power or the beauty of Black people, I think that we have to really start owning up to what's happening so that liberty and justice can be for all. And when we go back to scripture, we talk about the liberty of Christ and the justice of the cross. We didn't see those depictions on that day. We saw it as a form of bondage. We saw it as a form of abuse, as a form of threat. And that's the total opposite of what we know Christ to be in its infallible scriptures. And so I think that the role of folks who are white and are Christian and are in those states that do not align with the behavior or the illustration that took place on January 6th, they owe their congregations, they owe themselves, they owe their communities, and they owe the, I guess you could say, the prowess to show forth that they are not in alignment with such behavior, to speak up and to speak out. And then creating infrastructure. I can't say that we're even more, but creating infrastructure so that we can move forward, so that there can be progress. When you see others that are creating spaces for positive growth, purposeful and meaningful development, there's life there, there's community there. There is a level of livelihood that is sparked. And so I think the world had a very dark cloud over it on January 6th because of the acts that were taking place on the Capitol. Some people have even gave commentary in social media aspects saying if that were Black people, there would be a great massacre for January 6th. It would be something totally different. So I think that there's a responsibility that must be taken for those who are white and that identify with the Christian faith.
I agree with you 100%. So, Dr. Myers, I didn't want to cut you off. Did you want it to continue?
No, I think I would be happy to have Dr. Eutsay have the last word. That was perfect.
So I want to get into some identification here in regards to racism and social identity. So I'm going to skip to our fourth question. Is racism an inherent social identity amongst white Christians, or an influence of culture, and why do you think so?
Who wants to tackle that?
I will. I'll just dive right in there. I think it's both. I think Racism is something that can be inherited, DNA, passed down generation to generation. And I also think it can be taught as a form of influence through culture and society. So the reason being is that if you come from a traditional perspective of supremacy, of white supremacy, then it's a part of your makeup. You know, you live life through that lens. That is your optic stance. You see the way people engage and do things through that lens. And so I think that it is something that can be an inherited social identity amongst white Christians. And also I see it as a influence of culture, because it is a part of the ebbs and flows of someone's life. And if you are born into a system, which most of us have been, then you start to take on those attributes and behavioral patterns. And so you don't realize it unless you are educated, unless there's a moment of enlightenment, or unless there's a moment where you're challenged in your identity. But you will be able to see that it is a series of both. It is very layered. Racism is multi-layered. Culture is multi-layered. And I think that when we talk about white supremacy, it is a balance of both, unfortunately. I don't think there's one more than the other, because they both create the same outcomes. If you're in an environment that is socially ran a certain way, or if you're raised in an environment of a family construct, you know it to be a certain way, it's all to keep Black and brown people out of the position of having position of power, having economic freedom, having the ability to walk in liberty and to have an experience of justice, whether it is a social construct or family influence. I think they both create the same outcome. And so that's why I believe that it can be both, and that's why.
Absolutely. Dr. Myers, I want to get your response to this question.
Sure. I mean, I liked what you were just saying about environment, and it made me think of a text that I sometimes teach my students that I think is helpful for thinking about, thinking about this question that's just been posed. Barbara Tatum it's an old essay, but she has a great way of talking about how in the United States, white supremacy is part of the air we breathe, that it's like part of the atmosphere that we're all exposed to. And she's making that point both to say that it's unavoidable, right? But also that everybody is subjected to it, right? Whether you're a person of color, whether you're a white person, you're subjected to this. And so because it is sort of our default environment, it then requires a lot of vigilant unlearning, which is possible, right? We all know that's possible, but that has to be taken up in this context where we recognize just how pervasive and how sort of commonsensical that view is, right? So both recognizing the extent of it, but then also, you know, we have lots of examples of how people have come to stick with the metaphor that was just used, have come to be enlightened or have come to understand the wrongness of what they once, held true. So,
absolutely. Dr. Porter, is racism an inherent social identity?
Unfortunately, I think it is. I think the influence of culture plays a part. I mean, it kind of seems like the chicken and egg, which came first. I think they feed one another. Two sides of the same coin. The individual identity creates that culture. The sense that I am better because of my skin color, then I get with other people who think in the same way, and we establish culture to that end. So, unfortunately, I think it is. One of the things I try to tell persons who want to be enlightened, we've had many of these conversations since George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, long overdue conversations. There seems to be a desire to hear and listen. And one of the things I say is that even if you're not complicit in actively producing the system that is racist and oppressive, if you are not actively helping to dismantle it, you're complicit in it. You are the beneficiary of that racist privilege. The system was designed, it is designed that way. And because you are benefited by it, there may be some reluctance to dismantle it. So that identity, even if they don't grasp that it is white supremacy. I think people that stormed the Capitol, to return to that conversation, I think there were people who stormed the Capitol that thought they were doing their Christian duty in the mania of that moment. So that racist social identity, I think it is inherent, and I think culture has a part to play. I think there are so many factors that have produced. I think bad theology is probably the best or the most significant part of it. I think bad theology might be the problem, the most significant problem.
I agree with you 100%. Before you have to go, Dr. Myers, and we're going to wrap up because the time has gotten away from us. So I want to get Dr. Myers, if you have the time, I want to get your response to this question. This is practicality. This is how we put what we're talking about into practice. And that's question number 2. How can the community and the church influence the narrative of racism and change the trajectory of racist rhetoric and practices?
Oh, that's a big one and so important. I liked what Dr. Eutsay had said earlier about sort of each person figuring out what they have to contribute, right? All of us here in this conversation today, this is obviously something we care about, something that's part of our lives, but figuring out what is the biggest impact I can have? Where can I be of service in this way, right? Whether that's within a faith community, whether that's in an educational context, both, whether that's talking to, family members, whatever it might be. But this also makes me think about, the comment that, and this was also from Dr. Eutsay, you said this earlier about how, you are also wary of that language, of any sort of intimation that people should sort of wait for some other group to do something, right? And I thought that was a really profound point, and it reminded me of that famous text that was already mentioned, King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where part of what he's so aggravated by in that letter is this tendency to tell the civil rights activists to wait, to be patient, And one of the things King says in that piece that always just resonates with me is where he says, time is neutral. Like time is time. We don't know what it's going to be, right? It's up to us as political actors, as social actors, as religious actors, however we see ourselves, to do something with that time. It's up to us. It's not, it's not going to go in any certain direction, positive or negative, without our doing and our commitment. So I think that's all I have to say.
Dr. Eutsay, go ahead.
Yeah, as always, and that's just me naturally. So it depends on the person, of course, but I think it would help to help augment and adjust is for everyone to take on a role of leadership and create a doorway, create an opportunity. So any role that you have, create an opportunity for someone else to come in. Sometimes we tend to be very self-serving when it comes to faith and constructs of religion and things of that nature. But the operative servitude of it is to be a servant leader. So wherever you are in your dimensionality or functionality of the faith construct as it relates to dismantling racism, I think you should create a doorway, an opportunity for someone else to grow, to create liberty, to assert their justice, to feed their ability so that they can be their best self within this open, vast world. And I think sometimes we don't look at religion as a tool to push people out into the world, to make infrastructure. So I think it's important for folks who are listening or who have position of power, and it may not be in a political role, but if you are in a form of leadership, education predominantly, think of how you're making a doorway for others so that they can be their best self. I had a professor share with me, he says, even though my students come here with different backgrounds and ideologies, and I'm teaching this specific topic, I am to make sure that they can be their authentic self in the public square. And that stuck with me for so long because I think about my work as a student affairs practitioner, my role as a preacher, as a minister, my role as an educator, and I allowing folks to be their authentic self, their original being in the public square of the universe. So I think to help change narratives is to not put people in boxes, allow them to identify themselves with their purposeful meaning, and help them to engage with challenge so that they can have an answer for themselves. Sometimes we may give the answer and If the person is not really familiar, they'll take that as Bible or as facts. But we have to be able to stimulate people's thinking so that they can have their own voice. When we look at white supremacy, it's the ability to take away Black voices. It's the ability to take away freedom and liberty. It's the ability to put you in a space of limitation. So if you're a faith leader, or if you're someone that's hearing this, I think it's really important to think how you're creating a doorway, how you're creating an avenue, how are you creating a space where that individual can be their best self in a continuum? Because we're not just a human being, we're humans being. We are constantly developing, we're constantly evolving, and we're not limited. We're not limited. Even the research that we have, it gets outdated after a while, right? So we want to make sure that we're in a space where we're creating opportunity and creating a pathway that begets another generation and brings about another level of thinking. And we can create something that could be more harmonious and homogeneous.
Absolutely. And I like that statement. We are humans being. Yeah, I like that. That will preach. And I got to preach next Sunday. So that will preach. Dr. Pointer.
Amen. That's really all that needs to be said. The church, of course, has to be prophetic in both its proclamation and ministry. The church has to speak truth to power, and the community has to organize itself to stand up for the most marginalized in our communities. Those very practical things, I think, are the way we influence the narrative toward justice and away from racism that ends up begetting these unjust systems. So church, prophetic in not just in sermonizing and preaching, but certainly in the way we do ministry. It's far more effective to empower someone to buy groceries than it is to drop groceries off to them. That's what I mean by prophetic ministry. And community requires organization across systems of faith, economic levels, educational levels, persons of goodwill to come together to amplify our voices as we together say these things are unjust and we won't stand for.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. When I was doing my dissertation for my D.Min degree, United Theological Seminary, both Pointer and I are graduates from United Theological Seminary. One of the things that I discovered, my dissertation was on social change within the African Methodist Episcopal Church through the ministry of Bishop Joseph Gomez, who was elected in the late 1930s. And one of the things that I discovered from his writings and his sermons, he said you have to address the issue of a poor person's stomach first before you can preach Jesus to them. Mm-hmm. And so if we're going to be prophetic in what we do, I think we have to address the issues, as Pointer poetically just said. You have to address the issues of the problem before you can do anything else. Too often we're trying to save people and convince people that they need to be saved, and they're missing the message of the gospel, and they're missing the message of change. They're missing the message of positive influence, all because we have not addressed their issues. I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your schedule, being with me today. This has been a phenomenal conversation, and I really, really appreciate all of you. You have added value to my life today. And to my thinking. And so I'm very appreciative. I know you have to go, Dr. Mayers, but this is really the last question. And it's not really a question, it's a sign off. I ask everyone on my broadcast this question. Using the context of our conversation, define unholy silence. And I'll start with you.
With me?
Yes, ma'am.
I mean, in a way, I think we've sort of circled around this question a little bit already, in the sense that I guess I would define it as silence in the face of injustice, and that that it calls upon all of us to take action.
Absolutely, Dr. Eutsay.
I think of the phrase "going along to get along." I think that perpetuates unholy silence. We can no longer go along just to get along, because of doing that, we will continue to have the same fight, and we will continue to have lack of progress.
I agree. Finally, Dr. Pointer.
Yeah, unholy silence, I think, is either being complicit in the injustice or being afraid to address it. those who refuse to be complicit and those who are able to find some courage will speak up about injustice in the world, and specifically in our local communities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, let me thank Dr. Eutsay, Dr. Pointer, and Dr. Myers for being with me today and to helping us to articulate this conversation. It has been very enjoyable and educational, and I am very thankful to know all of you and for your influences that you create in your very perspectives, jobs, teachers, and ministries, and educational processes. So thank you once again.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. It's great to meet all of you.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, love your
Absolutely.
work, Dr. Myers. Thank you.
Oh,
and
thank you.
forging ahead.
Yeah, I'm trying. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. So as always, I would like to offer a final thought to kind of shape the conversation that we just had. Before I offer that final thought, I want to announce that on March 28th at 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, there will be a conversation, a very special conversation to honor the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright. We have guest panelists who have all been impacted through his ministry, his teaching, and through his work for the Black church and the culture. And so please save the date, March 28th, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will have with us Bishop Vashti Murphy McKenzie of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Bishop Elizabeth Ann Henning Byfield of the AME Church, Father Michael Flager of St. Sabina Catholic Church on the south side of Chicago, the Reverend William Lamar, pastor of Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C., our National Cathedral, the Reverend Dr. Cynthia Hale, is it Christ Temple in Memphis, Pointer? You're muted.
Christ, that's Dr. Stewart in Memphis. Dr. Hill is in Ray of Hope.
Ray of Hope, excuse me, Ray of Hope in Atlanta. And then finally, Bishop Rudolph McKissick of the Bethel Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida. So please go ahead and put that date on your calendar so we can have that conversation. We're going to honor this man for the work that he has done. He's a living legend. And I think that it's important that we give persons their flowers while they are still able to smell them. As a final thought to our conversation, racial equality as a normative influence of American values will not happen through a successional leadership change. Neither will it happen through a series of conversations that aim only to prove our willingness to talk about it. Concerned people like the church must be willing to see God, not just in the beautiful and flowery texts of faith and hope, but also in everyday social conditions of our human experience. The inconvenience of our humanity as normalized behavior is the true essence of racial equality. Seeing each other as God truly sees us will open the pathways toward racial harmony and acceptance, the only American value that matters. This has been Conversations with Faith Leaders. My name is Brandon A.J. Davis. I'm the founder of Content Writing Service and Conversation with Faith Leaders, and we will be back next Sunday, same time, same place. Thank you and take care.